So I looked down there, and sitting in a folding chair outside Trauma Room 1, Mrs. Kennedy was sitting there in her bloody clothing by the door of Trauma Room 1 in a folding chair. And I thought, oh, my God, this is really true. She came in and had this piece of his brain in her hand that she handed to Dr. Jenkins.
Showtime. Welcome to the show. It's Brent Holland from Night Fright. I'm very happy tonight. Very, very happy. I'm very pleased. I started, I guess, back in July to try and get the following guests this month coming on for our JFK special. Last year, as you know, when we did our JFK special, it was the first year for Night Fright. And I was intent on getting some of the best, or the best, I should say, researchers on to discuss the JFK assassination. It's very complex. It's very in-depth. It is extremely important. And as you know, Night Fright seems to be the only show of the paranormal / conspiracy that actually does conspiracies. And the reason is, I believe, it's still a hot topic and people shy away from it. They don't want to touch it for fear of stepping on somebody's toes and causing themselves some grief. Such is not the case for Night Fright, and I am very pleased to be able to bring you these types of shows, including this year. As I said, last year was extremely exciting for me. It was our first year, and we went into the top-notch researchers. This year, we're bringing you first-person witnesses, people who were right there in Dealey PLaza, right there in Trauma Room 1, and also Abraham Bolden, the first African-American Secret Service agent on JFK's protective detail, and what a story that will be. Tonight we begin with our JFK special first-person living history witnesses. And we begin tonight with none other than Robert McClelland, medical doctor. Tonight, living history. Parkland Hospital Trauma Room 1 surgeon Dr. Robert N. McClelland joins us. Tonight we begin our month-long series of first-person witnesses and the JFK assassination. It has been 46 years since the young president, husband to Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, and father of 2, John Jr. and Caroline, was gunned down in broad daylight at high noon on the streets of Dallas. The world has a filmed record of the assassination called the Zapruder film, and that, folks, I'm sure you've all seen. If you've seen any film at all of the assassination, it is most likely the Zapruder film. The Zapruder film was the most important document at the time because it showed the Kennedy motorcade coming across and then all the shots. But what did the first-person witnesses see? Dr. McClelland tonight is going to take us back in time directly into Trauma Room 1 in Parkland Hospital, just minutes after the shots rang out in Dealey PLaza. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes at high speed to get from Dealey PLaza to the emergency hospital where Kennedy would be treated. When Kennedy arrived, he was not dead. Let me repeat that. When Kennedy arrived, he was not dead. Unfortunately, the back of his skull was gone, but there was a heartbeat, and he was struggling to breathe. And when you've got the President of the United States lying in front of you, you pull out all the stops, folks, to try and keep this man alive. Through Dr. McClelland's eyes, he takes us directly beside the head of the fatally wounded President of the United States, John Kennedy, as he lay dying on an emergency room gurney. Dr. McClelland has been called upon to testify to the American government's Warren Commission in 1964. Let me explain very quickly what the Warren Commission is. Everybody who's listening now, I'm sure, is familiar with 9/11. There was a commission put together by the American government to investigate what went wrong in 9/11. The Warren Commission did the same thing. They investigated the assassination. He testified for them. He also testified for the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978. Again, there was another commission put together in 1978-79 that was to look into the 3 assassinations: the Bobby Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, and the JFK assassination. Now, what I'm about to tell you is going to be a big surprise to you, because that particular HSCA commission had the final conclusion that there was a probable conspiracy in the JFK assassination. Dr. McClelland has also been on a very special PBS Frontline expose on the assassination. Over the years, Dr. McClelland has come to believe that what the Warren Commission presented was a lie, and offers his own perspective and theory as to what took place that day, November 22nd, 1963. Tonight, the true story of Dr. Robert McClelland, emergency room surgeon who was in trauma room 1 that day, pulling out all the stops to resuscitate and to try to save the life of the young President John F. Kennedy. Tonight we present that true life testament by none other than Dr. Robert McClelland himself. Folks, it simply doesn't get any more real than this. Strap in and hang on. Here we go. Welcome to the show, folks. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Tonight, Dr. Robert McClelland. Dr. Robert McClelland is a 1954 graduate of the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. Following his internship at the University of Kansas Medical Center and 2 years of military service in the Air Force in Germany, he completed his residency in general surgery at Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he attended to President John F. Kennedy in the emergency room. And we're going to get into that tonight, baby. And also attended Lee Oswald 2 days later, and we will also get into that too. Yeah, he was right there for Lee Harvey Oswald. He then completed a 1-year fellowship in splanchnic hemodynamics, I apologize, with Dr. Bashur in the Department of Internal Medicine at UT Southwestern in Dallas. He was appointed to the faculty of UT Southwestern Medical Center in 1962 and is the first faculty member to hold the Alvin Baldwin Jr. Chair in Surgery, an endowment designated for support of surgical education. His primary interests, life in gastrointestinal surgery and in postgraduate medical education. As originator and editor of Audio Journal Review, General Surgery and Selected Readings in General Surgery, his influence as a medical educator extends beyond the department into surgical training programs throughout the country. Dr. McClelland will be with us in a minute, but first I want to take this opportunity to set up the assassination, and I have 5 smoking guns, if you will, that I've always pointed back to for those that disbelieve the assassination was a conspiracy. And the first one I'm going to play it right now. Just give it a listen to set up our November special on JFK. There are 5 main things that stood out in my mind and convinced me completely that the JFK assassination was a conspiracy. I'm going to go in sequential order, starting with the very first thing that finally convinced me completely that indeed the JFK assassination was a conspiracy. All those years ago, taking place on November 22nd, 1963. So this is an FBI report that was omitted and buried, and the Warren Commission never used it or reported on it for obvious reasons, as you'll see as I start to read it. Now, this was reported in John Davis's book, which was called Mafia Kingfish, and he wrote that on the morning of Wednesday, November 20th, 1963. Now, that's 2 full days before the assassination, but close enough that it should have raised a red flag. Listen to this. 2 police officers on routine patrol entered Dealey Plaza. They noticed several men standing behind a wooden fence on the Grassy Knoll overlooking the plaza. The men were engaged in what appeared to be mock target practice. They were aiming their rifles over the fence in the direction of the plaza. Hello! The 2 police officers immediately made for the fence, but by the time they got there, the riflemen had disappeared, having departed in a car that had been parked nearby. The 2 patrol officers did not give much thought to the indication at the time. But after the assassination, they reported the incident to the FBI, which issued a report of it on November 26th. So that's 4 days now after the assassination. And Oswald's already been killed. Now, here's the funny part. For reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, the substance of the report was never mentioned in the FBI's investigation of the assassination. And the report itself disappeared until 1978, when it finally resurfaced as a result of a Freedom of Information Act request. Now, I'm pretty sure that Freedom of Information Act request probably came from a very famous researcher that got involved in this in the 1960s, and his name and credit should be going to Howard Weisberg. Unbelievable. That was, when I read that, man, the alarm bells went off and everything else. 2 days, so just to recapitulate, 2 days before the assassination of President Kennedy, the police chased a bunch of guys that were doing mock target practice on the very spot that Kennedy was to be assassinated 2 days later. And they buried the damn report. Now, if that's not a conspiracy, but wait, there's more, and I'm not talking about steak knives. Rose Cherami. Now, Rose Cherami was a hooker. She was a drug addict among many things. She was also a mule for drugs for none other than Jack Ruby. Now, Jack Ruby was the guy that shot Oswald, who was reported to have killed JFK. Now, let me just read this. And this is from a book called Ultimate Sacrifice, Lamar Waldron. The evidence confirms that a woman using the name of Rose Cherami had worked for Ruby and was a low-level part of the heroin network that included Marcello, Trafficante, and Michelle Mertz. And that these are all mafioso kingfish, by the way. These guys are huge. Makes Tony Soprano look like just a grocery clerk. November 21st, 1963, that's a day before the assassination, she told law enforcement and medical personnel that JFK was going to be assassinated in Dallas on Friday. Rose Cherami was one of many, at least 30, aliases used by Melba Christine Marcades, a woman with a long history of prostitution and other arrests since she had turned 18. Approximately 34 years old in 1963, she had worked as a B-girl for none other than Jack Ruby and had been mainlining heroin for 9 years. She also had a small child, a boy. According to a Louisiana police report in mid-November 63, she worked as a dope runner for Jack Ruby and had worked in the nightclub for Ruby. More details came from the congressional testimony of Francis Fruge, a lieutenant with the Louisiana State Police in 63. Fruge asked Cherami what she was going to do in Dallas. She very commonly said, number 1, pick up some money. Number 2, pick up her baby. And number 3, kill Kennedy. This was late on the night of November 20th, 1963, when Fruge and a secretary from his office were accompanying Cherami on a trip to the East Louisiana State Hospital for treatment of a heroin withdrawal. He testified in court that Cherami related to me that she was coming from Florida to Dallas with men who were Italians or resembled Italians. They had stopped at this lounge, they'd had a few drinks, gotten into an argument about something. The manager of the lounge threw her out, and she got on the road and hitchhiked to catch a ride. And this is when she got hit by a vehicle. Just speculating, but I'm pretty sure it was the guys who were driving her. They'd hoped to kill her, actually. She had been initially treated for those injuries at a private hospital and released. While in jail to sober up, she began exhibiting acute symptoms of heroin withdrawal. So Fruge and a secretary accompanied Cherami on the 1 to 2 hour ride to the state hospital where she could be treated. During the trip, Fruge asked Cherami some routine questions and said during these intervals that Cherami related the story about JFK, she appeared to be quite lucid, so she was sober at the time. Fruge paid little attention to Cherami's story about Kennedy, as did the doctors and nurses at the hospital when Cherami was admitted. Apparently she was telling all the nurses and everything about the Kennedy assassination coming up on the very next day, actually. As Dr. Victor Wise, head of the psychiatry department at East Louisiana State Hospital, told congressional investigators, and also in a filmed interview for journalist Jack Anderson, and I quote Dr. Wise here, Rose Cherami was absolutely sure Kennedy was going to be assassinated in Dallas on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. And in fact, he was, and kept insisting on it over and over again to the doctors. Dr. Weiss said that Cherami had told them word was out in the New Orleans underworld that the contract on Kennedy had been let. However, according to Louisiana police report, Dr. Weiss said that he didn't really pay much attention to the woman until the assassination occurred. Lieutenant Fruge also started paying attention, but it was Monday, November 25th, before Cherami was well enough to be interviewed again. That's when Cherami told him the two men traveling with her from Miami were going to Dallas to kill the president. Now, what ended up happening, I'm just going to give you the Reader's Digest version, was Rose Cherami ended up dead. Another one of those JFK witnesses that mysteriously ended up dead. When Fruge went looking for her for the Jim Garrison investigation in 1968, he essentially found out that she had passed away under mysterious circumstances, quote unquote. She was lying on the side of the road, and a car would have had to go way out of its way and ran over her head. Very nice. Also, what ended up happening was the Houston police checked out the name of the seaman she had given and the boat, and in fact, that was legitimate information, and arrests were made, and was a drug bust. So there it is. Somebody knew in advance of the JFK assassination. Now, there was many others that also knew in advance that JFK was going to be indeed hit, but that's the one that stood out in my mind because it had an official record with a police enforcement. It just wasn't one witness saying it to another witness. So that was number 2. And I'm back. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Tonight, we begin our whole month special on JFK. That was a little vignette I had made, actually, going back to summer 2008. And I just wanted to play that just to try and set up tonight's guest. Tonight's guest, Dr. Robert McClelland, was the surgeon directly involved in trying to resuscitate fatally wounded president who had arrived at Trauma Room 1, Parkland Hospital. Parkland Hospital was only 3 or 4 minutes emergency drive from Dealey PLaza, where Kennedy was fatally wounded. When Kennedy arrived, he was not dead. He was still living, his heart was beating, he was struggling to breathe. Our guest tonight, Dr. Robert McClelland, was the surgeon working in Trauma Room 1 when JFK was brought in fatally wounded. And without further ado, I shall play that interview right now. November 22nd, 1963, the day President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated. We're speaking with Dr. Robert McClelland. Dr. McClelland, how did you begin your day?
Well, it's not so much how I began my day. I don't think that was nothing particularly different about that, but what I was doing immediately before I was asked to come down to the emergency room to take part in the care of President Kennedy. And I can tell you what I was doing exactly there.
Yes, please.
I was in the operating room at Parkland Hospital on the second floor in a conference room showing a training movie of how to perform a hiatus hernia repair and showing that to some of the senior surgery residents. That's what I was doing when I heard a tap on the door, and went to the door, shut off the movie projector, went to the door, looked out, and Dr. Charles Crenshaw, one of the senior surgery residents, was standing there and asked me if he could come outside and tell me something. That was what the immediate entry into this whole situation. That's how that started.
What did he tell you, sir?
Well, when I stepped outside, he said they have, in rather hushed voice and alarmed voice, I knew there was something going on, the tone of his voice and the register of his voice. He said, "Oh, Dr. McClelland, they've just called in and on the emergency phone in the emergency room, and they said that they are bringing President Kennedy in right now, that he's been shot during the motorcade downtown. And so they want everybody on the faculty, that included me and some other people, to come immediately down to the emergency room at Parkland, which was 2 floors below me in the operating room. So we got on the elevator there in the operating room, and that took us immediately down to the emergency room. And while we were going down to the elevator, I said to Dr. Crenshaw, I said, "Well, Chuck," we call him Chuck, his name is Charles Crenshaw, "you know, we get stories like this all the time. Hopefully this is nothing. It's just a matter of, you know, somebody got mixed up on what happened." And so about that time, the elevator door opened, and we walked around a little corner of out of a small hallway out into the main part of the emergency room, which at that time was about 1/4 the size of the emergency room at Parkland now. But in that emergency room back in '63, there was a large central area that we called the pit. And then around that central area were patient cubicles for examining patients with whatever kind of emergency situation they came in for.
I see.
But this central area around which those cubicles were located, we call the pit. And in that area, in a most unusual sight, we saw that the whole area, the whole pit, was jammed with men in business suits wearing hats. You know, everybody wore suits and ties and hats and whatnot back in those days, even criminals, you know, dressed to the nines back in that day. And so I thought, well, this is strange. Where did all these people come from? About that time, the crowd parted, and I looked down through them, through the little corridor that was made when the crowd parted, and I could see off into the area just off of the pit where there were 4 emergency rooms, things that we call trauma room 1, 2, 3, and 4, that were arranged alongside a little hall that led off the pit. And so I looked down there, and sitting in a folding chair outside trauma room 1, just off that little hall, right off of the pit, Mrs. Kennedy was sitting there in her bloody clothing by the door of trauma room 1 in a folding chair. And I thought, oh my God, this is really true. So that's up to that point.
What was your immediate thought as soon as you saw her? I mean, obviously you'd seen her on television before.
Well, yeah. Well, I knew that probably what Dr. Crenshaw had said was very likely true, that she wouldn't be sitting there in bloody clothes as she was had the president not been shot. My immediate thought, first thing I thought of is, oh my goodness, I'm the only faculty person here who is the only physician who is on the faculty. At that time, our surgery faculty at Southwestern Medical School consisted of only 4 people. And my chief, Dr. Shires, I knew was out of town in Galveston at the Western Surgical meeting, so I knew he wasn't here. And the other three, or the other two, besides myself and Dr. Shires, I didn't know where they were, but I thought they might be. It was right around noon, out of the hospital, somewhere eating at one of the eating places along Harry Hines. And so I thought, I may be the only one here, the senior person here, not the only one here, but the senior faculty person here. So I had to almost force myself to continue walking back to Trauma Room 1. And I did that. And Doris Nelson, the large lady who was the nurse in charge of the overall emergency room, was standing there at the entrance to that little hallway just across from Mrs. Kennedy. And she was standing between two large men that I immediately took to be Secret Service men from the things they had in their lapels. And they were asking her to say whether whoever was going by should or should not be allowed to pass. So she noted to them that I was one of the doctors, and so they waved me on through into Trauma Room 1, and I went in through the door to Trauma Room 1. And I was relieved to see immediately that my two colleagues that I hadn't known where they were, Dr. Charles Baxter and Dr. Malcolm Perry, had already arrived just before I had, and in fact had already just begun performing a tracheotomy incision on the president. Dr. Perry was on the president's right side at his neck, and Dr. Baxter was helping him, standing on the left side of the president. And Dr. Jenkins, the anesthesiology professor, had also arrived, and he was controlling the president's respiration with an anesthesia machine, squeezing on the respirator bag, and breathing from the president.
What were your first impressions, your thoughts entering into Trauma Room 1 that day?
Well, you don't do a lot of thinking. I mean, that's not when you do, I'm thinking this, I'm thinking that. I wasn't thinking anything. I was just reacting. And what I did when I saw them, I was relieved that they were there. I immediately moved on into the room, and Dr. Perry handed me what's called an Army-Navy retractor. He reached across the president, handed me this instrument, and said, Bob, would you go and stand at the head of the gurney where the president is here and lean over and hold this retractor in the upper edge of the incision we're trying to make in the trachea area so we can see better. So I immediately did what I was told, and not stopping to think about anything that was going on because things were moving fast. And I just did what I was told, went up there, stood immediately above the president's head and could see right down into his very large wound, and leaned over that and put the retractor blade into the incision and began to retract the wound so Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter could continue their work with the tracheostomy. That's what I did then.
Now, you've got the President of the United States on the table. Did that register at all, that, oh my God, I'm working on the...
Sure, it registered. I mean, I knew that's who it was, and I knew he was gravely injured and all of that. But what I'm saying is that in those situations, not just him, you go into kind of automatic mode. Everything is moving so fast that you can't stand around and sort of think, what am I thinking? What is this? What does this mean? You do that afterwards, but you don't do it at that point. You just go into automatic mode.
Okay, fair enough.
Your mind is not working.
When you walked in, was he fully clothed? Was he just down to his shorts?
No, he had been cut out of his clothes. That was one of the first things they do with any trauma patient is cut them out of their clothes with scissors.
And did you think that he was fatally wounded at that time? Was everybody hopeful that perhaps you could resuscitate him?
Oh, I don't think there was little if any hope. I mean, he had a obviously fatal head wound. I mean, it destroyed most of the right side, the back half of his brain and cerebellum, and he could not have survived that wound. And people then say, well, why did you do anything? And there's no real good answer to that. You, as I said, you just go into automatic mode. And what Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter, I think, were thinking, they didn't tell me this, but because they didn't like to talk to anybody about this afterwards. And in fact, Dr. Perry absolutely refused to. And but what I think the reason they started that trach was that they not only his respiration was being controlled through an endotracheal tube that had been placed into his trachea by Dr. Jim Carrico, who was the senior surgery resident, or not the senior, but the junior surgery resident in charge of the emergency room as a resident when the president came in. And so before he was even taken into Trauma Room 1, as I understand it, I was not there at the time, but as I understand it, Dr. Carrico took a laryngoscope and placed an endotracheal tube into the president's trachea at that time and connected it to a breathing machine. And so he was had an airway being controlled by Dr. Jenkins, and it wasn't that he needed to have a tracheostomy actually at that time to control his airway. I mean, eventually he would have needed one just to be able to take that endotracheal tube, which is not a permanent device, out, and to have a permanent airway through the tracheostomy. But in addition to that, the other indication for incising into his neck at that point was not only to do the tracheostomy, but he also had a small wound in his neck right at the site of the tracheostomy. I didn't see that because they had already made the cut through that wound when I got into the room. But Dr. Perry told me as he continued to work, he said, "Bob, there was a little injury here where we made the incision for the tracheostomy, and we don't know whether it was an entrance wound or an exit wound." We had no knowledge, of the circumstances at that time, being immediately after the fact. We knew nothing of what went on in Dealey PLaza or anywhere else outside of where we were at the time.
Right.
But he said there was this small wound there, and he said there's hematoma around the trachea. So anyway, they were apparently afraid that one of the major blood vessels in the neck, either the carotid artery or the internal jugular vein or both, might have been injured and would need looking at. So that's a secondary reason, or even another primary reason, to make an incision in that area, not just for a tracheostomy.
Was there a pulse at all? Was there a heartbeat?
Oh, yes, there was a heart. If he hadn't had a heartbeat, he would have, president or not, he would have just been declared dead.
I see.
But he had a heartbeat, and he was making agonal attempts, that is, difficult attempts, to breathe. In other words, his chest was heaving up and down, and his heart was beating, and he was immediately connected to an electrocardiographic cardiac monitor, so his pulse and his heart rate was being monitored in that fashion, not just by feeling of his pulse or listening to his heart. It was being monitored with an ECG monitor, an electrocardiographic monitor.
Dr. McClelland, was President Kennedy conscious at all when he was brought in?
No, he was totally unconscious.
And what part of the brain was blasted out?
It was the right part of his brain, and I would estimate, and it's only an estimate,
Yes,
that
sir.
probably the posterior, the back half of the right cerebral hemisphere and a portion of the cerebellum were blasted out. In fact, a portion of the cerebellum oozed out of the huge hole in the back of his head as I was standing there holding the retractor. I saw that fall out of the back of his head. But then I could look down into the skull cavity and see where the back part, the back half of the right cerebral lobe was missing also.
Would that wound place him in a condition that he would be brain dead, so to speak?
Oh, yes, because he would have had, in addition to injury to his brain like that, the cerebellum and the cerebellum, he would have had mid-brain injury, which is the seat, really, the initial institutor of consciousness, if you will, the thalamus, the diencephalon, the mid-brain part.
Okay.
That was damaged also.
Was there any wounds to the other side of his head, his left side?
Well, I was told that there was by Dr. Jenkins when I came into the room.
Oh, is that right?
Dr. Jenkins' hands were busy, so he couldn't point really, but he nodded his head in what I took to mean the left temple, and he said, "Bob, there seems to be a wound there in the left temple." Well, his head was covered with blood, and I couldn't see any wound in the left temple, but I wrote that in my immediate impressions that I wrote down after we left Trauma Room 1, immediately after we left there. The Secret Service men gave each one of us a sheet of paper and asked us to write down our immediate impressions of what we saw and did in Trauma Room 1, and that was like 15 minutes after we left down there. And those, in fact, if you look at the New York Times condensed version of the Warren Commission. Those things we wrote down were photocopied and reproduced in that New York Times abridged version of the Warren Commission that the New York Times put out.
Sir, when you were looking at his body, did you notice any other wounds in any other areas of his body?
No, and we didn't go over his body, all over his body. And we did miss a wound, as we learned the next day from the pathologist at Bethesda Naval Hospital. We missed a wound in his back, but he had no other wounds. And as it turns out, that wound, apparently there was no wound in the left temple, as I mistakenly was led to believe by Dr. Jenkins. And he first said that there was a wound when Dr. Jenkins first testified to the Warren Commission. He had said that he thought there was a wound in the left temple. He didn't necessarily say he saw it, but he also told the Warren Commission investigators in his initial testimony that he had told me he had seen a wound in the left temple. However, in subsequent testimony, he denied that and forgotten what he said in the first of his testimonies to the Warren Commission.
Okay.
But that's what he did say to me, but both of us were apparently mistaken about that.
When the president died on the table, how did his body react? Was there a last breath, or did he just simply fade off?
No, the way his death was determined, his respirations, of course, were being controlled by Dr. Jenkins, who was squeezing on the anesthesia bag.
Mm-hmm.
And so that he wasn't really making any agonal attempts to breathe then. That was only when he first came into the emergency room before he was connected to the anesthesia machine, and his breathing was taken over by Dr. Jenkins with the anesthesia machine. Now, the way his death was determined, Dr. Clark, who was the neurosurgeon there, was standing by the electrocardiographic monitor connected to the president, and he was watching what the monitor was showing all the time, and all of a sudden the monitor straight lined, showed that all cardiac activity suddenly stopped. And he told Dr. Perry that had happened, and so Dr. Perry stood up on a stool and gave one or two pumps to the president's chest, and Dr. Clark said, "I don't believe I would do that, Malcolm, because he's gone. The president is gone."
When he said those words, how did you feel, sir?
Well, again, you don't stop and examine how you're feeling. You're just numb throughout that whole thing. You're
right.
thinking, how do I feel? You're just in a state of shock, but you're not verbalizing anything internally.
Was Jackie Kennedy in the room at that point?
She came in and out of the room, and Dr. Clark, trying to protect her, kept ushering her back out into the hallway by her chair. But she came in and out one or two times while the tracheostomy was being done. And Dr. Clark each time ushered her back out gently.
Was there any thought that she may have been injured as well?
No, she didn't seem to be injured at all.
There's a story that was reported where Jackie Kennedy was holding a piece of President Kennedy's brain and crunched in her hand.
Yes, she was. That's indeed true. And I didn't see that, but Dr. Jenkins told me that when she came into the room initially, right as he was getting connected to the anesthesia machine, and he had just arrived, she came in and had this piece of his brain in her hand that she handed to Dr. Jenkins, is what he told me.
In the hopes that that could do something to help her husband.
Who knows?
She
just,
knows?
Reached out and handed it to him.
I can't even begin to think what she had gone through.
No.
It must have been completely surreal for her. Did Vice President Johnson ever come in or make any inquiries as to how the president was doing?
I never had any contact or knowledge of him that day.
Can you tell us, were you present for the preparing of the body and moving into the casket when the priest came in? Okay, you were out of there.
No, I was there when the priest came in. In fact, what happened there is of some interest. As soon as he was pronounced dead, the room, trauma room 1, which had been full of different people, other than the people who were actually working on the president, there was a large crowd milling around in there of physicians, most of whom didn't even need to be there, but they had gotten into the room. Anyway, when the president was pronounced dead, everybody immediately and rapidly left the room. And Dr. Baxter and I, though, were in a position where somehow or other we got pushed against the wall as the gurney with the president on it got pushed aside by the crowd leaving the room. And it pushed Dr. Baxter and me against the wall of Trauma Room 1.
Whoa.
And before we could push it out of the way and walk around the end of it and also leave, the door to Trauma Room 1 came open, and in walked the priest who was to administer last rites. And he was walking toward us, and we would have had to almost knock him down to get around him and get out of the way and leave the room. So we just froze and stood where we were, and he came in and began to administer the last rites while Dr. Baxter and I were standing there. And I heard him say the very first words of whatever the ceremony was he started, and he said, leaned over the president's head. He had uncovered his head from the sheet, had been covered with a sheet, and he said, "If thou livest." And then I couldn't hear anything else he said after that. Okay. And he completed in words that I couldn't hear the short last rites, and was just finishing that. And Mrs. Kinney again walked back in, and she stood at the head of the gurney by the president's head, and right next to Father Huber, who was folding up his equipment in his little bag that he had used for the last rites. And she apparently, although in a very low voice that she had, I couldn't hear what she asked, but I assume she asked him if the president had received last rites, and I could hear what Father Huber's answer was to her, and he nodded and said, "Yes, I have given him conditional absolution." And with that, Mrs. Kennedy grimaced as though she was not happy with that statement, but didn't say anything. She stood there for a moment, and there was an exchange of rings between her hand and the president's hand, and for some reason, that's the only missing part of my memory in this whole scenario, which is otherwise emblazoned into my mind like it happened this morning.
My God.
I can't remember whether she took a ring from his finger and put it on hers or vice versa. But anyway, there was an exchange of rings between her and the president, one way or the other. And after that was done, she stood there for a moment. Then she walked to the end of the gurney where the president's right foot was protruding out from underneath the sheet that had been used to cover him when he died. Mm-hmm. And she leaned over for a moment and kissed his right foot, and then turned and left the room. That was the end of it. And at that point, Father Huber left, and Dr. Baxter and I followed him immediately after that. That was my last contact with what happened in Trauma Room 1.
The Night Fright website, www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. You'll be able to pick up all the archives there for free. Just click on the little archive button. No problem whatsoever. The whole month, folks, we've got first-person witnesses to the JFK assassination coming on. Living history. It doesn't get any more real than this. Tonight we've got Dr. Robert McClelland. We're playing an interview that I had taped actually with him several weeks ago. There were some scheduling problems, and I offered to tape him in advance, and it's worked out well. Next week we have James Tague coming on. James Tague, everybody's going to go, who's James Tague in this assassination? James Tague was in Dealey Plaza that day. Dealey Plaza, of course, is where the shooting took place. James Tague was in front of the motorcade, standing by a triple overpass. What is unique about James Tague's story is he is indirectly responsible for the magic bullet. Now, you've all heard of this famous magic bullet. What the hell is this magic bullet? Well, the magic bullet took place because James Tague was also wounded that day. He was the third person wounded in Dealey Plaza that day. The Warren Commission, which was the commission set up to investigate the JFK assassination, thought they had an open and shut case. Everything was sealed, dealed. They were all set to go to press with their theory. Their theory was they had found 3 empty shell cases in the Texas School Book Depository, which was behind the motorcade at a sniper's nest, where Lee Harvey Oswald was purported to have shot the president. So you've got 3 empty shell casings, 3 shots, 3 wounds. Very nice, neat package. Let me explain what their first theory was for the Warren report. The first shot hit Kennedy in the back, approximately between the shoulder blades. Did not go through Kennedy, but caused Kennedy to flip to the side a little bit, exposing directly in front of him Governor John Connally of Texas. The second shot hit Connally, went through Connally, shattered his rib, broke his wrist, did all kinds of damage to Connolly. This is according to the Warren Commission. The third and final shot in the first Warren report had the bullet going into the back of Kennedy's head and killing Kennedy, taking the rear of his head off. And we'll get to that too in a second. Then, as they were going to press with this theory, James Teague comes along and says, wait a second, I was wounded too. And indeed he was. There's written reports by police officers who gave him first aid. He was hit by a ricochet standing near the overpass in front of the motorcade. So, virtually, the Warren Commission said, uh-oh, problemos. They went back to the drawing board and said, okay, what do? We got 4 wounds now. Not just 3, but still only 3 shell casings. Damn, I wish we had a 4th shell casing. Aha! Our inspector steps in, and he comes up with this brilliant idea called the magic bullet. And I put brilliant in quotation marks because not so brilliant. Okay, the Warren report comes out, second version of it, and it states, the first shot now misses the motorcade completely, bounces off a curb, ricochets, and a piece of that ricochet injures James Teague. There's the first shot. You got 2 more shots to account for 3 wounds, right? So the second shot no longer hits Kennedy in the back between the shoulder blades. It now hits him in the neck. It goes through the front of his neck. Dr. McClelland was just talking about the tracheotomy taking place, and everybody who saw it in Parkland, by the way, thought it was an entrance wound, not an exit wound. Goes through Kennedy's neck, goes into Connolly, through his back, shatters a rib, breaks his wrist, causes 7 wounds, this one little bullet. Now, why this bullet is magic? Because not only does it achieve all this, but it is found about half an hour later in Parkland Hospital, sitting alone on a gurney in pristine condition. And when I mean pristine, if you've ever been hunting, and if you've ever shot an animal, shattered its rib cage, shot it through the head, you know the bullet comes out mushroomed, right? It deforms. This bullet was in perfect condition. Not only was it in perfect condition, but it didn't have any blood on it, and it didn't have any tissue on it. So this is the magic bullet. It gets better, folks. The third shot and fatal shot, they still have going into the back of Kennedy's head, but it doesn't exit in the front of the head. It exits in the back. So this bullet basically has to do a U-turn to come back out in the head. Right. Okay. Ask anybody else who's been hunting if they've ever seen an animal who's hit in the side fall towards the bullet and not away from it. Okay, so James Teague will be here next week, all that to say. The week after, one of my heroes, and I say that with full admiration, Abraham Bolden, the first African-American Secret Service agent handpicked by JFK himself to serve on White House protective detail. What a story, folks. It is riveting. It is heart-wrenching. He was subjected to racism. He was subjected to persecution by the American government. And to this day, he is still trying to clear his name. He has personal stories of JFK, where he met him. He met Bobby Kennedy, Pierre Salinger, all these famous people. He was offered to be an ambassador by Bobby Kennedy. Amazing, amazing story. After the assassination, he was not on protective duty that day that Kennedy was shot, and he's still haunted to this day by that. Tragically, he's still haunted. He feels that if he had been on duty that day, somehow, some way, he would have stopped the bullet, either by putting himself in front of the bullet or perhaps getting on top of Kennedy right away. He was a whistleblower against the Secret Service afterwards, charged them with drunkenness, and as it turned out, he was exactly right. And because of that whistleblowing, he was falsely accused. First-person witness here on Night Fright. So without further ado, let's get back to Dr. McClelland and the interview. And it gets even better.
What's it been like for you to live with this all these years? I mean, you get guys like me calling you all the time for interviews and things
it's
of
not
that.
all the time. I do about it once a time. I've gotten used to it. It hasn't really affected my life.
Do you ever play those scenes over in your head over and over again?
Oh, no.
No way.
This isn't like something that happens like post-traumatic shock syndrome.
I see,
People are,
right.
It doesn't affect me. At least it didn't affect me that way. I mean, I don't mean to sound, callow and uncaring.
You don't.
I'm not saying that at all. It's just that when you do what I do, and that is, I'm a surgeon, and I have ever since I began my surgery residency in 1957, one of my main jobs has been taking care of seriously injured patients. So this is not a once-in-a-lifetime sort of thing. This is an everyday event for me throughout my life, this sort of injury and treating this sort of injury of greater or lesser degree in all kinds of people. Now, granted, none of them are the President of the United States, and so I don't mean that doesn't have its, particular significance. But nevertheless, it's not as if I were just someone that this is the only trauma patient I ever treated. I've treated literally in my long life hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I would say up to thousands of patients with traumatic injuries. So I'm used to it, if you will.
As a doctor, sir, and for the students that are listening, what is it like when you lose a patient? Can you describe that experience for them?
Well, you mean when you first begin to learn how to operate and do things like this?
Yes, sir.
Oh, sure. Well, when you're first getting into this, you do. You're queasy at the stomach. Sometimes even people, I never have done this, fortunately, but people even faint and fall down, dead away in the operating room and have to be revived. But that very quickly goes away, and you soon become used to it and realize that you have to stay in there for the patient's sake. You can't be deferring to how do I feel about this. You have to put those things aside and keep your mind attending to the patient, not attending to your feelings or your thoughts.
Can we talk about Lee Harvey Oswald?
Well, again, I'll go back sort of to square one, how I first encountered that he was injured. This was, of course, on Sunday, 2 days after Friday, the second day after Friday. I was at home. It was, again, around noontime. My wife was upstairs getting dressed to go out to dinner with my mother and our 2 young children. And my mother was visiting from East Texas, and we were going to go out to lunch. And I was sitting downstairs waiting for them to get ready upstairs, and I thought, well, I'll turn on the television set in my living room and see what the news is, see what's going on in light of what had just transpired on Friday. So I turned the TV on, and as the picture was forming up, I could hear the sound even before the picture became apparent, and a voice was saying, he's been shot, and I thought, my goodness, what is this now? Then the picture formed, and I saw the famous scene that everyone's familiar with now, of Oswald having just been shot by Ruby and had slumped to the ground, and this deputy sheriff in the big Stetson hat is bending down over him and looking to see what's happened. And so with that scene in mind, I stood up, walked to the foot of the stairway in my house, and called upstairs to my wife, and I said, I'll have to forget lunch. I have to go to Parkland. They've shot Oswald. And she called down and she said, who is Oswald? And I said, he's the man they say shot President Kennedy. They've shot him now. So I got in my car and headed for Parkland. And on the way there, I met Dr. Shires, who was now back in town from his meeting in Galveston on Friday. And in fact, he had arrived back Friday about 3 hours after the assassination had occurred, and got there in time to operate, along with me and Dr. Baxter, to explore Governor Connolly's leg wound. And so he had arrived back earlier than that. But anyway, I saw his car approaching me on the street going toward Parkland, and we stopped and stuck our heads out the window and asked each other, did we know what had just happened? And we each one had heard, I had seen it on TV, he had heard it in his car radio just then, and so we said, well, we'd better quickly get out to Parkland, and we did. He turned his car around, headed back to Parkland, and I followed him rapidly out there, and we got to Parkland and went into the emergency room just after Oswald had been received into trauma room 2 there in the emergency room and was being attended to by a crowd of residents who were intubating his trachea, connecting him to respirator machine, pumping blood into him, and so on, getting him ready to go up to be operated on immediately. And so that's, after looking in there and seeing that they were doing that, Dr. Shires and I went upstairs to change quickly into scrub suits, and by the time we did that, Oswald had been taken upstairs and was lying on the operating room in the Parkland operating room. And from the time he was wounded someone was looking at this, told us that it was just slightly over a half an hour from the time he was wounded until Dr. Shires had made the midline abdominal incision to explore his abdominal gunshot wound. So that was how quickly that came about.
Wow, that's really fast. What was your initial thought when you heard that he was shot?
Again, I don't go into, well, do I think this, do I think this happened? I just got up and said what I had to do, and I went out and got in my car and went out to Parkland.
Okay, fair enough. Afterwards, when you had time to reflect, did you think that it was strange that Oswald had been shot by Ruby?
Oh, yes, and not only that, but who shot him? And,
Yeah.
of course, since then, I've accumulated here, there, and yonder through the years a good deal of information, of, some good, some not so good, perhaps, that has colored my thinking along the way over the years as to what happened, and that there is a conspiracy rather than Oswald being a lone shooter.
I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you next time.